The jungle does not hum at night, it screams. But on the night of January 24th, 1945, in the mountains of Luzon, the jungle went silent. And that silence was more terrifying than the noise. At 0200 hours, the perimeter of the 209th Anti-Aircraft Battalion was breached. It didn't start with a gunshot. It started with a smell, the sickly sweet scent of sake and unwashed bodies drifting out of the elephant grass. Then came the sound that turns the blood of veteran soldiers into ice water. Tenno Hika Banzai. 3,000 Japanese soldiers, fueled by desperation and commanded to die, erupted from the darkness. They weren't using tactics, they were using their bodies as kinetic weapons, a human tsunami of bayonets and grenades crashing into a thin line of terrified American infantry. But in the center of the camp, sitting under a camouflage net, was a weapon that could stop them, a weapon that could turn this massacre into a math problem. There was just one issue. The general commanding the sector had made it illegal to use. 3 days ago, standing in this exact spot, he had pointed a finger at the sergeant in charge of the M16 Halftrack and issued a standing order. "This turret is for birds, Sergeant, not for the ground. You will keep those barrels cold until you see a zero. If I catch you firing on infantry, I will have you court-martialed for sabotaging the air defense of this island." The general was terrified of the kamikazes. He was saving the barrels. He was following the book. But the general wasn't in the foxhole when the Banzai charge hit. The sergeant was. And as the first wave of Japanese infantry overran the machine gun nests, the sergeant didn't look at the sky. He looked at the butterfly triggers of his quad .50 caliber. He reached down and flipped the safety off. He knew that what he was about to do would either save every life in the platoon or send him to Leavenworth for the rest of his natural life. This is the story of the meat chopper and the night it went rogue. To understand why this moment was impossible, you have to understand the enemy, not the Japanese, the doctrine. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had mutated. The Japanese Imperial Army had stopped trying to win. They were trying to bleed. They dug into the coral and the volcanic rock, refusing to surrender, forcing the Americans to pay for every inch of ground in blood. But the real threat was in the air, the kamikaze, the divine wind. Suicide pilots were slamming into American carriers and airfields with terrifying regularity. The U.S. High Command was paranoid. Every anti-aircraft gun, every bullet, every spare barrel was to be hoarded for the defense of the fleet and the airfields. Using a specialized anti-aircraft weapon to shoot at soldiers in the grass was considered a misallocation of strategic resources. It was a crime of logistics. The weapon in question was the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage. To the layman, it was a half-track. To the enemy, it was the devil. On the back was the Maxim M45 turret. This wasn't just a gun, it was an electric chair for aviation. It held 4 M2 Browning heavy machine guns. A single .50 caliber round can punch through a concrete wall. It can tear a man in half. Now, multiply that by 4. The M45 was wired to a single solenoid trigger system. When the gunner pressed the paddles, all 4 guns roared to life, spitting out 2,000 rounds per minute. The Tombstone drum magazines held 200 each. It was a storm of lead that could saw an airplane wing off at 2,000 yards. But the engineers who built it in Ohio installed a safety feature, a depression limiter. This was a heavy steel bolt that physically prevented the guns from aiming too low. It was designed to stop an excited gunner from accidentally shooting the driver's cabin or the friendly troops standing in front of the vehicle. The guns could not depress below -10 degrees. This meant the M16 was useless against a Banzai charge. If the enemy crawled on the ground, they were in the dead zone. They were safe. The gunner could shoot the leaves above their heads, but he couldn't touch them. The sergeant knew this. He was a mechanic from Detroit. He didn't care about the general's barrel preservation order. He cared about the fact that his friends were sleeping 10 yards from a bamboo thicket that smelled like trouble. 2 nights before the attack, under the cover of a monsoon rain, the sergeant committed his crime. He climbed into the turret with a heavy metal file and a wrench. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't log the maintenance. He dismantled the elevation gear. He found the depression limiter bolts, the steel stops that kept the guns pointed at the sky, and he filed them down. He ground the steel away until the mechanism screamed. He modified the turret so the guns could depress past the safety limit, past 0, into the negative numbers. He hacked the machine so the barrels could literally sweep the grass. He turned an anti-aircraft platform into a lawnmower. Then he reassembled it, covered it with the tarp, and waited. He knew that if the general inspected the rig, he was finished. Unauthorized modification of government property during wartime is treason adjacent. But the general didn't come back. The Banzai charge did. 0200 hours, the breaking point. The first wave of Japanese attackers hit the perimeter wire with Bangalore torpedoes. The explosion blinded the forward sentries. Then the screaming started. The infantry defense collapsed in seconds. It wasn't a lack of bravery. It was simple physics. A bolt-action rifle cannot stop 500 men sprinting at full speed. The Japanese soldiers were over the sandbags. They were in the trenches. It was hand-to-hand, knives, bayonets, teeth. The platoon command post was about to be overrun. The radio operator was screaming "Broken Arrow" into the handset, the code for a unit that is being wiped out. The sergeant in the half-track kicked the sleeping gunner out of the seat. "Get the belt," he screamed. He climbed into the bucket seat. He spun the turret. The electric motor whirred, a sound like a giant dentist's drill. He saw them, a wall of white uniforms moving through the dark. They were 30 yards away, too close for artillery, too close for mortars. If the depression stops were still in place, the sergeant would be aiming at the moon. He would be watching his friends die. But the stops were gone. He pulled back on the joystick. The 4 heavy barrels dropped. They dipped below the horizon line. They pointed directly at the waist level of the onrushing horde. He squeezed the butterfly triggers. The sound of a quad 50 caliber opening up at ground level is not a sound. It is a pressure wave. It shakes the fillings out of your teeth. Thump, 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 thump. The night turned into day. The muzzle flash was a blinding strobe light that revealed a horror show. The 4 streams of 50 caliber tracers converged on the center of the Banzai charge. The result was not combat. It was physics. The meat chopper lived up to its name. The lead element of the Japanese assault didn't fall down. They evaporated. The heavy rounds traveling at 2,900 feet per minute hit the mass of bodies and turned them into a red mist. The kinetic energy was so massive that it pushed the dead bodies backwards into the living ones, creating a wall of gore that stalled the charge. The sergeant didn't let up. He swept the turret left to right. He was grazing fire, keeping the rounds parallel to the ground. He was cutting the jungle down. Bamboo trees as thick as a man's leg were sheared off in midair. The Japanese had never seen anything like this. They expected rifles. They expected fear. They did not expect a wall of lead that defied the laws of their cover. "Reload," the sergeant screamed. The loaders slammed fresh tombstone drums onto the receivers. The barrels were glowing cherry red in the dark. The heat was so intense it was singeing the hair on their arms. "Don't stop. Feed it." The sergeant fired for 20 minutes. He melted the barrels. He burned out the solenoid. He turned the field in front of the platoon into a butcher's shop. When the smoke cleared at dawn, the silence was heavy. The platoon commander walked out of his bunker. He looked at the field. He looked at the hundreds of enemy bodies that had been stopped just 10 yards from the wire. He looked at the trees that had been mown down as if by a giant scythe. Then he looked at the half-track. The general arrived an hour later in a jeep. He saw the devastation. He saw the steam rising from the overheated guns. He walked up to the turret. He looked closely at the elevation mechanism. He saw the file marks. He saw the shiny bare metal where the depression stops used to be. He realized instantly that the sergeant had disobeyed a direct standing order. He realized that the weapon had been modified illegally. The general looked at the sergeant. The sergeant stood at attention, covered in soot and oil, waiting for the handcuffs. The general looked at the survivors of the platoon, men who were smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, men who should have been dead. The general slowly reached out and ran his finger over the filed-down stop. He turned to the sergeant. "Sergeant, get those barrels changed. We might have air raids tonight." He got back in his jeep and drove away. No court-martial, no medals. Just the silent acknowledgement that the rule book had failed and the outlaw had won. The M16 Halftrack went on to become a legend. In Korea, they used it against the Chinese human waves. In Vietnam, they put the same turrets on trucks to fight in the jungle. The lesson is written in the brass casings on the floor of the Luzon jungle. Commanders fight the war on maps. Soldiers fight the war in the mud. The general banned the turret because he was trying to save the fleet. The sergeant modified it because he was trying to save his brothers. Innovation in war rarely comes from the top down. It comes from a terrified kid with a file, a wrench, and a refusal to die. And sometimes, the only difference between a war criminal and a savior is where the barrel is pointing. This leads us to a haunting question about the next war. As our systems become more automated, more locked down by software and safety protocols, will the next sergeant be able to file down the stops, or will he die pressing a button that the system refuses to answer? Think about that the next time you trust the plan.